If you want to stop losing to the burst protocol meta right now, regardless of what deck you're playing, you need to know how to interrupt these decks and not just memorize where to hand trap them. And in this video, I'll show you the exact choke points that can actually shut these decks down. Alright, so the way I usually structure these videos is I'm going to start by going over some of the key cards you should know about in each of these archetypes, so you're not just memorizing like certain spots they hand trap. Instead, I'm hoping you'll actually be able to understand like what the key choke points of each deck are, and so this way, no matter what hand trap that you have, or if you're not even playing hand traps and have like other ways to interrupt your opponent, you'll know exactly which cards you need to cut your opponent off of. So starting off with the Magistus engine, I'm mainly just going to be going over the new Magistus stuff because I think that's going to be the most relevant. And so following that theme, the most important card in the Magistus deck right now is going to be Spoon. And this is the card you're going to see no matter whether people are playing Magistus as a pure deck or as an engine. But I actually think you want to consider cutting Spoon off entirely from like being able to search. For example, if you have a hand of like Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence, I think there's a good argument for just stopping Spoon from being able to search in the first place with Ash instead of trying to hold Imperm for when they actually search the monster. And the reason for that is because Spoon also has a bonus graveyard effect that allows them to attach any Magistus monster from the extra deck or grave to any Magistus monster they control. And so if you cut them off of getting access to Magistus bodies on the field somehow, or like let's say for example you're able to remove the Magistus body on the field that they commit, then Spoon really loses a lot of its value. I also put Zoroa here because Zoroa is the main monster that they're going to be searching, and Zoroa basically just whenever something gets equipped to it is able to reborn one back from the grave. Zoroa alone will like turn into two bodies, and then those two bodies can turn to like rank 4 or generic synchro 8. So I really think you want to cut off Spoon from getting access to a body in the first place. Now something else to consider is specifically the Magistus Link 1. Its effect when it's equipped to a Magistus monster is that you get to search any Magistus monster from your deck to the hand. Most of the time this is going to be Crowley the Gifted Magistus because it has that Snake Eyes Poplar like effect when it's added from deck to the hand. You're able to special summon it out and then you can fusion summon it into anything. A cool thing about this card is that it does act as Alistair the Invoker, so they're able to make quite a large variety of different fusion monsters, but the most important one that you should be aware of, at least when within like the Magistus engine itself, is going to be Invoked Magistus Omega. And that's not actually for its like actual effect, because most of the time its actual effect is like good, but like it's not really going to be the effect you care about. The effect you really care about is when it's destroyed, it lets you summon a level 4 spellcaster from the deck. And that's most likely in this format at least going to be Dracotail Lucius. And how did they destroy it, you may ask? That's with their old Synchro 8. Basically, when the Synchro 8's in the grave, it's going to be able to pop one of their monsters, summon it back to the field, and that will trigger a card like Invoke Magistus Omega, just to sort of sum it all up. The main combo for Magistus is going to go like discard Spoon, search Zoroa, normal Zoroa, activate Zoroa effect to equip something random from the extra deck to it. Zoroa is going to bring back Spoon, then they're going to Synchro summon into the Synchro Zoroa, and then from there, the Synchro monster is going to be able to equip the Artemis from the extra deck to it. Artemis is then going to be able to search Crowley. Crowley will summon itself and then fuse itself and the Magistus Synchro off into the Omega. And then the Synchro is going to activate in the grave to pop the Omega and summon itself back in the grave, which will ultimately allow them to summon a card like Lucius from the deck. So there are a couple of different ways you can stop this combo, in addition to the ways that I mentioned, just like cutting off Spoon from serving a body in the first place. But you can also do things like Ogre a card like Artemis, for example, because it does need to be equipped for it to successfully go through. You could hit a card like Zoroa in the graveyard with something like DD Crow to prevent it from popping Omega. So different things that you can do to just stop this engine from really being able to pop off. And then for this next section, the way I usually do it in these guides is I'll basically have a screenshot of like all the relevant hand traps in our metagame right now. And I'll talk about the most interesting or the most important hand trap that you should be aware of. You don't have to necessarily memorize this. It's just to give you a better understanding of like what types of hand traps are generally good against each engine. I think the most interesting ones against Magistus is first going to be Fua. This engine is going to go through the extra deck a lot. Magistus Omega summons a guy from the deck. So if you hit them with a Fua, it's going to be very difficult for them to get value from their engine without giving you a bunch of draws. Something else that's like also interesting, I think graveyard removal like Bystials or Crow can be particularly good against this engine because Spenta is a light monster, and if you're able to cut off that body from the graveyard, not only do you cut off its graveyard effect from equipping something from the grave or the extra deck, you also cut off a card like Zoroa from being able to bring it back from the grave. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone. I think generally the most common hand traps like Imperm, Ash, like they're also going to work pretty well against this engine because there are a couple of different spots like I talked about where they can be super impactful. So overall, I think that there's nothing too crazy in terms of the hand traps that are good against Magistus. I think the most common ones you'd expect to be good will actually end up being good against this deck. Alright, for this next section, I'm going to talk about the new branded cards that we're getting from the set as well. The most important one is going to be Fallen the White Dragon. You're able to dump a card like Albion to the graveyard, summon it from hand, and then summon a card like Ecclesia from the deck. and then that Ecclesia and Fallen is going to be able to turn into the Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon Synchro monster, which is then going to summon Blazing Cartesia from the deck. And now that may not seem super impressive because you may think like, oh, Fallen White Dragon basically just turned into Blazing Cartesia without your normal summon, like cool. But this one card has set up so many plays for the Branded player in the end phase. Not only do they get the Albion effect in the end phase to set or add a Branded spell or trap, they also get Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon back from the Banish Zone, and plus Blazing Cartesia's in rotation. Like every turn a fusion monster gets sent to the graveyard, it's able to add itself back from the grave to the hand. Most of the time, like this one card combo is going to get them access to Fallen the Virtuous in the end phase off a card like Albion, and then Fallen the Virtuous of course has that effect to potentially pop one of your opponent's face-up cards, but also perhaps more interestingly, now that you have access to Ecclesia monsters within the combo itself, you can actually get the additional effect of Fallen the Virtuous to reborn any monster from any graveyard. So this can not only act as potential graveyard interruption, but if you also have a very key monster in your graveyard like Fallen Valbas, for example, you can use that to interrupt your opponent even further. It's kind of hard to stop Fallen from like fully resolving because they'll always be able to dump Albion from the extra deck to the graveyard. But if you hit Fallen, for example, a card like Imperm, you're basically cutting off the Incredible Ecclesia recursion, you're cutting off the Synchro Ecclesia from returning from the banish. You're also cutting off Blazing Cartesia access, so I think hitting that can be pretty good. Or if you don't really care too much about that, you can save cards like Bystials, for example, for Albion, and that could turn off Fallen the Virtuous, which can be, like I said, a very flexible card that allows them to interrupt you. So now going over the best hand traps against the Branded deck. Of course, Ash Blossom on Branded Fusion, everyone knows that, but I also think something that is particularly good against Branded is going to be the Bystials. Like I said, hitting Albion out of the graveyard is very good because not only does it act as a pseudo Ash Blossom in that case, you also get the extra body on board, and there's so many other times in the Branded deck where they're going to have light or dark monsters that they want in the grave. And so I think Bystials are something you definitely want to consider putting in against the Branded deck. I think a card like Retaliating Sea could also be pretty interesting against them, because at least in the pure Branded deck, they are going to use spells like Branded Fusion to Fusion Summon, and even though they don't necessarily auto-lose to having all their cards banished, it does hurt their graveyard recursion quite a bit. Perulia Meows are not going to be great against this deck. You might get like one draw, maybe two draws. Even a card like Fulos, which is generally pretty good. I think that unless your opponent very specifically starts with like Fallen the White Dragon, it can be kind of difficult for Fulos to get a ton of value, because the Branded deck can just do a lot of stuff on the opponent's turn. So while I'm not saying these cards are bad by any means, I think it's just something to be aware of. If you're enjoying this video so far, I just want to take a quick second to ask you guys to subscribe to the channel. I really want to hit 15,000 subscribers before I graduate from university around like the middle of 2026. And so if you haven't subscribed to the channel, then it really means a lot. By subscribing, you not only tell YouTube that you're interested in seeing more of this, you also help keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this to help you guys out. So if this video gave you any value at all, then I just ask that you please consider subscribing to the channel. And if not, that's all good too. Thank you for watching the video. Alright, for the next deck I'm going to talk about, that's going to be Rokket. I think the main thing to remember against the new Rokket cards is like they get a new starter in Rokket Loader, and Rokket Loader is kind of one of those cards you want to stop from snowballing advantage really early on. So I know sometimes like you guys might want to hold your hand traps for like key choke points later on in the combo, but I think with a card like Rokket Loader, you really want to stop it before it gets going at all, and that's because Rokket Loader will generally search a card like Absorautor. Absorautor can then summon itself, and then now they have access to not only Striker Dragon from the Rokket Loader body, they're also able to turn that Absorautor and Striker Dragon into any Link 2, and then that just starts snowballing so much more advantage to where your single copy of Ash Blossom or single copy of Infinite Impermanence just isn't going to get nearly as much value. So I feel like at least against Rokket Loader start, you want to hit this card right away to prevent them from getting access to an extra body or an extra extender they can summon out to the board for free. Another key card in the Rokket deck is going to be Rokket Tracer. This is the main tuner that they're going to use for their synchro plays. Rokket Tracer, of course, is also able to get them access to a card like Rokket Loader directly from the deck by popping any face-up card. So I think if you cut your opponent off of Tracer access, it's going to be very difficult for them to really make any meaningful plays. They're going to have to hard open a card like Quick Launch, for example, or they're going to have to hard draw a card like Rokket Loader. So I think Rokket Tracer is also something you want to consider hitting. And then other key cards in the Rokket deck are going to be the Link monsters. Borderland Dragon is one of their big boss monsters on their end board, and it can be really difficult for a lot of decks to deal with because it can't be destroyed by battle or card effects, and it also can't be targeted by monster effects. So I think if you have a card like Imperm, let's say you just have a single copy of Imperm, for example, and you know your deck struggles against a card like Borderland, I think there is some merit there to holding that hand trap, to making sure you have an out to that Borderland Dragon, because if you don't out it, it's just going to clear your entire board and just OTK you the next turn. And then lastly, their main Link monster you should be aware of is Striker Dragon. Striker Dragon basically can be made with any of their level 4 dragon monsters. So at the start of the combo, throughout the combo, Striker Dragon is also able to pop anything to like add a Rokket back from the graveyard. So this card does a lot for the Rokket deck. The Feel as Well as Searches acts as an additional extender as well. So this is also one of those cards, at least against the pure Rokket deck, you want to consider hitting with like Ash or Imperm. Maybe in a deck like Dragon Link where like they don't rely as heavily on the Rokket engine, you could consider letting it go through. But I think you should just be aware that Striker Dragon is the main monster they're always going to be going for. In terms of hand traps that are good against Rokket, I think the most interesting ones to talk about are like a card like Purulia. Purulia, not only can it hit their normal summon, cards like Boot Sector Launch do extend from the hand. Cards like Absorata are also summoned from the hand as well. So Purulia could give you many chances to like draw a bunch of cards. They do tend to summon from the hand quite a lot during their combo. Another card that's also pretty interesting against Rokket is going to be Ogre. Ogering the Feel as Well can be really good, not only to cut off a piece of extension, but it also cuts out them off a follow-up as well. Because if Boot Sector Launch stays on the board, then it is additional follow-up for them on the next turn. And then finally, this is also a deck where I think a card like Phantasme could really shine. Even if they're not playing like a Dragon Link build, like I said, the Rokket deck is always going to go into Striker Dragon. And so if you are choosing to play a card like Phantasme, it's also a matchup where Phantasme can get a ton of value. And then for the last of the new decks from Burst Protocol, that's going to be Elvennotes. So the way that Elvennotes deck basically works is their main deck level 6 monsters can all special summon themselves out for free to the center main monster zone. And then all of them have some sort of effect to give them additional advantage, like search a monster, place a spell face up, place a trap face up. And then the way they're going to try to play, like extend from there is like through a card like their Power Patron monster or through a card like Magistus the Pure, which gets them access to the Power Patron monster. The Power Patron enables the synchro plays for the deck, and then they're able to, for example, move the monster in the center main monster zone to another zone, just continue extending from the hand. And then from there, they're going to be able to keep spitting bodies onto the board, and then depending on the variant of Elvennotes, they could go into an engine like Fiendsmith, or they could keep it like pure and try to set up like the Elvennotes Trap card, which can be an interruption on the opponent's turn. And they can start setting up like multiple things to interrupt you, like the Trap card or the synchro monster. I think this one is a little bit harder to pin down in terms of like what exactly their choke point is, but because there are a couple different variants of this deck and different ways this deck can be played. But I think the main thing you want to cut off is going to be their Power Patron access. Without the Power Patron, they don't get access to their synchro monsters. They also lose out to the search ability the Power Patron gets them when it's sent to the graveyard. So you'll cut off a lot. For example, if you're able to stop a card like Magistus the Pure from being able to summon Elvennotes Power Patron from the deck. In terms of hand traps that are good against Elvennotes, I'll say the main one that stands out is definitely going to be Purulia. Like I said, they all summon themselves out from the hand. If you hit them with a card like Purulia, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to extend really far without giving you a bunch of advantage in the meantime. Other than that, though, I personally think this deck is actually quite resilient to most of the hand traps, at least the Elvennotes engine itself, just because their monsters, like, even if you hit them with a card like the Imperm, they still keep the body. And if they're able to get access to the Power Patron monster, then they're still able to do their main combo and gain a ton of advantage that way. So like I said, you really want to focus on cutting off the Power Patron access, and you want to hit them with high impact cards like Purulia, which might be one of the few hand traps that are able to full stop them. And then for this next section, I'm going to be talking about what I personally feel like are going to be the 3 most relevant like old decks that we've had from like a prior format. I did put out a poll a little bit ago that asked like whether you guys wanted to see like all the new decks or just the decks I felt were most relevant from the new set. And the poll was pretty much 50-50. And so I felt like for in the interest of time, like I'm only going to talk about what I personally feel like are the most meta relevant decks that are actually going to impact the metagame from the new set. But if you have any questions about like any of the other decks and where to stop them, then you can leave them in the comments below and I'd be happy to answer them. For this last section, I'm going to blitz through it a little bit quicker than I did before because I assume most of you will have already seen these decks already and know what they do. The first thing against Dracotail, I think the most important thing to be aware of is like they have access to Spoon and Fall in the White Dragon now as additional starters in the deck. They're no longer constrained to just like using the Dracotail engine in the deck. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like these new starters in Fallen and Spoon just get them access to a fusion outlet, which is what the Dracotail deck is trying to do. So I think your game plan against Dracotail when trying to stop them is still going to be cutting off the fusion access. Whether it's hitting a card like Hartesia with it, like Imperm, preventing Fallen from getting to Ecclesia in the first place, stopping Spoon from adding a Zero in the first place, getting access to Omega, and then Omega summoning Lucius from the deck. Things like that. You want to cut them off from getting access to fusions in the first place. That's also why I put like 5 mana and Ketu here. These are additional ways that the deck can fusion summon, or in Ketu's case, a way to search a fusion outlet. And so, for example, if your opponent just like starts with a Ketu, and let's say your only hand trap is Ash Blossom, I think hitting Ketu with Ash is pretty reasonable there, because like if they don't have any way to fusion summon, then you've effectively passed their turn, no matter how good the rest of their hand is. And then just the last thing to be aware of against this deck, you could also make the argument of saving your hand traps like Astra Bell or Purge to stop the trap cards if you don't have a good way to play around them. And also something to be aware of, Athalion's graveyard effect is also something that I see some people forget at times, and so just be aware that it is a body that's able to come back, giving them a Dracotail name on the board. In terms of good hand traps against Dracotail, I think there's nothing too crazy here. Dracotail is generally a deck that's pretty good into most regular hand traps. Even a card like Fua, it doesn't necessarily have to play into it to set up a reasonable board. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, like cards like Ash Blossom and Ghost Ball have a little bit higher value in this matchup because they are able to stop the Dracotail traps. That can not only prevent them from interrupting you, but that can also cut off important follow-up for the next turn. Other than that, though, I feel like against Dracotail, most hand traps are just going to be fine. I don't think there's anything that's like super standout against Dracotail, I guess, other than a card like Shifter and maybe a card like Impulse, because they can't stop those fusion outlets from resolving. And then for another deck I haven't talked about before, that's going to be Radiant Typhoon. They do get new support from the Burst Protocol set, but I do think the most important cards to be aware of are going to be those older cards that we already had. The first one I want to talk about are the little level 3 monsters, Swen and Eldum. The gist of them is like if they have an MST in their graveyard or you have no set or spell and traps, they can just special summon themselves out from the hand for free. So immediately, one sort of counterplay you can do against this deck is like set your spells and traps, even if they aren't actually like real cards, just to make it as hard for them to summon these guys for free from the hand as possible. Because if they constantly are getting free special summons from the hand, it makes it a lot harder for you to stop them. Whereas if they have to commit their normal summon to one of these guys, their plays become a lot more linear and a lot easier to stop. Another important card I think you want to be aware of is the Radiant Typhoon Crocy. Basically, when they activate a quick play spell, they can drop this from the hand, and then this is going to be able to search them not only MST, but also any Radiant Typhoon card from the deck or grave to the hand. And so this is their way to like get massive advantage again and again. So if you only, let's say, have a card like Ash Blossom, you may want to consider stopping a card like Crocy because it does give them like +1. Another important thing to remember against the Radiant Typhoon deck is like all their quick play spells have the additional utility of being able to add Mystical Space Typhoon from deck or grave to the hand. And just keep in mind, like when you're playing back row against this deck, it is generally going to be pretty susceptible to them activating Mystical Space Typhoon. Another thing to be aware of against this deck, a play the Radiant Typhoon player may make is like activate one of their quick play spells, then chain MSD on their own quick play spell to destroy it, and then that quick play spell is able to reset itself for the next turn. So just be aware that this is a play that they can do. So even if you don't have spell and traps like that, you feel like you're giving them value for their MSD can still be valuable in that matchup because they can pop their own cards and reset them again. And then lastly, I want to talk about the interruptions that this deck actually has. The first one is going to be the Trap card. The Trap card basically turns MSD into like a negate or a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend. And the way that they get to the Trap is through their Link 2 generally, or through a card like Crow. If you're able to have a card like Imperm for the Link 2, then that's something you definitely want to prevent them from getting access to, because they can search multiple copies of MSD in a turn, and that can turn into multiple negates. Another way they interrupt you is with their big Radiant Typhoon monsters. The way these guys work is like they'll usually try to get them into the graveyard. When they play MSD, the big guys can summon themselves out back from the graveyard. The Phoenix here is going to be able to shuffle cards on your field back into deck, and they have another monster negate as well that's also pretty solid. If you don't want them to come out, like I think just preventing your opponent from getting access to Mystical Space Typhoon can be pretty good. Or if you just negate the activation of Mystical Space Typhoon somehow, it can also prevent them from summoning themselves out too. In terms of hand traps that are good against this deck, I think the most interesting one is going to be Perulia. This deck just summons so many times from the hand, and I'm pretty sure all of their extension is pretty much going to come from the hand a lot of the times. So if you have hit them with a card like Perulia, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to play. I also think a card like Droll Mocker is very solid. The only caveat I would say is like they do play all quick play spells, so there is a chance they can just do stuff in the draw phase to play around it a little bit. Another cool interaction is with a card like Ghost Ball, because a card like Croces is able to add cards from the grave to the hand. You're able to stop that entire effect, so it can act as an additional Ash Blossom in that case. And not to mention, the Radiant Typhoon quick play spells also have the potential to add Mystical Space Typhoon from the graveyard. So if you want to cut your opponent off from getting MSD because they have like the Trap card, for example, hitting them with a card like Ghost Ball can be pretty solid too. Other than that, I think this deck is actually pretty resilient to most common hand traps. And so I think you just want to be aware to not cram too many of these into your deck when you do play against this deck. And then the last old deck I want to talk about is going to be Vanquish. Just because they did get a lot of help this last ban list, I think it's going to be a little bit more popular now. Just as a quick reminder, the main gimmick of Vanquish is like they'll reveal different attributes in their hand, and then they'll get additional effects that way. Their main monster they're always going to want to get access to is Raisin, because Raisin is able to search them any Vanquish Soul monster from the deck to the hand. That can fill in the missing attributes that they need to complete their plays. I also think a card like Stake Your Soul is definitely something you want to consider stopping, because not only will they telegraph like exactly what monster that they're trying to summon from the deck with the attribute that they reveal, if you're able to cut off the Vanquish Soul monster from hitting the board in the first place, it prevents all their shenanigans of like bouncing the Vanquish Soul monster back to the hand, adding it back to the hand with Rokket the Vanquisher and things like that. Speaking of Rokket the Vanquisher, this is also one of the key cards on Vanquish Soul because this is what gives them all their grind game, basically. You're able to constantly add a Vanquish Soul monster from the grave back to the hand or summon one out from the hand. The main thing to keep in mind against Holisu is like just keeping track of like what attributes the opponent has in the hand. So if you know, for example, your opponent doesn't have a dark monster in the hand and they constantly try to get access to it through like a search card or a card like Rokket the Vanquisher, you want to stop them from getting access to that monster to prevent their Vanquish Soul monsters from getting full value. And then last thing just to be aware of against this deck, their main spell card is going to be the Vanquish Soul Start Field spell. Not only can it search them the exact attribute that they need, it also sets them the trap card in the end phase if they have 2 or more Vanquish Soul monsters on the board. So I think if you have a card like Ash Blossom against a card like Dr. Madlove, which is attempting to search out Start, it's definitely something you want to consider. You just don't want them to get access to Start on the field because it also has that really annoying effect to protect the Vanquish Soul monsters from being destroyed by card effects too. In terms of hand traps that are good against Vanquish Soul, I think there are very few that are actually really good. But once again, I think Purulia has its chance to shine here. This is also one of those decks that wants to spam out a bunch of bodies from their hand onto the field. And so if you're able to hit them with Purulia, not only during their turn, but also during your own turn, it could lead to you getting a bunch of draws because all their interruptions rely on them like taking out the right monsters, summoning out cards like Holisu from the hand. And then I think Ash Blossom is also something that shines a lot here because, like I said, it's able to stop your opponent from getting access to those key attributes that they may be missing. One thing to be very wary of against Vanquish Soul, though, is using target interruption like Infirm or Veiler. These cards are not particularly great because your opponent has the potential to have one of the big Vanquish Soul monsters to bounce the little guys back to hand and just completely dodge them. If you have these cards, I recommend you probably should just save them for either the K9 side of the deck, or you should save them for Rokket the Vanquisher to prevent them from summoning one out from the hand to the field, or adding one back from the grave. And so that's going to do it for this weird hand trap guide for Post-Burst Protocol. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. Do you think I missed any important decks or missed any important interactions? I'd be curious to hear what you think. And before I end off the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to Card Trader. You can check them out using my affiliate link in the description below and use code tcgsam for 5% off your entire order while helping to support the channel. All that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.